All right, so this is the last of the PowerPoints or lectures for this set of PowerPoint notes. Okay, so populations and factors that impact populations. So we're going to hit the high points here. Population density. This is the number of individuals of a population present per unit area. And there's more to populations than just density, like there's spatial patterns as well, but we're not going to get into that in this course. But if we look at this particular picture and we look at the large cacti, their population density is lower than the population density of all of the smaller, low-growing plants. Okay, and we could just combine all of those and kind of lump them together. Small plants in this picture have a higher population density than the cacti that have the lower population density. Okay, per unit area, and I don't know what this unit area here is in this picture, but we could say that within a meter meter by a meter plot of soil, okay, with plants growing in it in a forest or out in the courtyard or something like that, what's the population density of the species there? Okay, now populations are going to change size. There's 4 reasons for this in general, and we can see those here in the diagram. Number of births, or the birth rate. Okay, notice the arrows going into the population of the birds sitting on the tree. Number of deaths, or the death rate. Okay, and then immigration, individuals coming into the population, and emigration, individuals exiting. Okay, so notice, even though we don't tend to enunciate quite like that, immigration with an I. Okay, I'm going to run out of room that's not in the white here. Okay, but that means think of that as into the population. And emigration with an E, think of it as exiting the population. Okay, to help you remember that. So those 4 things are going to dictate population size. In the grand scheme of things, populations are fairly stable, right? Your birth rate and death rate tend to equal each other, and your immigration and emigration rates tend to equal each other. And of course, at times we see changes in that, okay? But those are pretty much going to kind of balance each other out in most populations typically. Let's go back to this for just 1 second. So when we tie this to food chains and food webs, let's say, for example, that in a forest, okay, that these hawks lived in, that the snake population increased, hence my up arrow. As a result of that, if there's more snakes for the hawks to feed on, then perhaps the hawk population is going to increase because more of them are going to survive and reproduce and make more babies, and that's the birth rate going up. Okay, let's say that the snake population decreased, right? Then as a result of that, there might be a food shortage, and so therefore more birds are going to starve to death potentially, and the death rate would increase. So that might cause some flux either way, just depending on the specific example in that particular population. Okay, so here, regardless of whether we're talking about like birth rate, death rate, immigration, or emigration, populations are going to grow, okay? That being said, most populations tend to remain stable in size, and populations can decrease in size. But this is where we're going to talk about growth, and there's 2 types of population growth: logistic and exponential growth. Notice the definition of exponential growth goes with the picture that's on the left. Okay, so this is a growth pattern in which the individuals in a population reproduce at a constant rate. Okay, so that being said, your exponential growth curve, it looks like the letter J, right? It's a J-shaped curve. That in bacteria are a great group of organisms to talk about with this. That if we start with a single bacterial cell, about 20 minutes later, we'll have 2 bacterial cells. About 20 minutes after that, we'll have 4. Then we'll have 8 20 minutes later. Another 20 minutes, 16, then 32, then 64, et cetera, as that population continues to grow. Right? However, populations cannot grow indefinitely, right? So they can reproduce at a constant rate, but then something's got to keep populations in check. Okay, so notice the definition of logistic growth is that this is a growth pattern in which a population's growth rate slows or stops following a period of exponential growth. And so a logistic growth curve looks like the letter S. And notice you've got a term carrying capacity listed up there, okay, that we're going to talk about on the next slide. All right, so not the next slide yet, but you do see carrying capacity here. Again, the definition of it's on the one that follows this. But when we talk about exponential growth of a population, essentially this population is able to grow pretty consistently because there are unlimited resources. There is plenty of food, there's plenty of water, plenty of shelter, plenty of space. Okay, there's no predators, there's no disease. There's basically nothing keeping this population in check. But in the real world, that cannot happen forever. Okay, populations are constantly kept in check. Okay, so when those populations are kept in check, that's your logistic growth curve, right? And so notice here, these are the things that can lead to a flattening of this particular exponential growth curve. They can lead to a flattening of that curve and give you the logistic S-shaped curve. Excuse the bell that's ringing since I'm doing this at school. All right, so what's going to lead to logistic growth? So the number of births will decrease to knock the population back. The number of deaths can increase to knock the population back. A combination of those can occur. Okay, so it could be one of those or it could be a combination. And then immigration or movement into the population can occur, or emigration, individuals leaving the population can occur, or it can be a combination of those. Okay, and so notice then this last point, it just says change does occur, but overall populations tend to remain fairly stable, and they tend to hover around what's known as carrying capacity. Okay, so let's go on to that. So carrying capacity is defined as the largest number of individuals that a population can support. Okay, and so obviously depending on the population that we're talking about, that number could be millions, it could be 10, you know, if you're talking about something that's a top predator, for example, and I don't really mean 10, but you know what I mean, it can just be different sizes. Okay, and so this can be determined mathematically, which we don't really do. Okay, carrying capacity in this diagram is just shown as a nice straight dotted line, okay, at the top of that curve. But this is what really happens in nature, okay? That let's say, for example, that bacterial population I was talking about, that it gets really, really, really big, then that might be that overshoot, and then there's no food for the bacteria, okay, to decompose. And so then you'd have dieback, and some of those organisms, those individual bacterial cells, would die. Okay, and so this is what tends to happen, okay, is that sometimes populations are above carrying capacity and sometimes they're below that. But if we were to look over time at long periods of time, then that's where that dotted line comes into play. What's kind of this maximum idealistic number, okay, which really just doesn't exist, okay. So that being said, the next thing, what are the things that cause the growth of a population to decrease? These are known as limiting factors. And there's two types of limiting factors that are going to cause population size to decrease. They're either density dependent or density independent factors, meaning that density dependent factors are dependent upon population density and density independent factors are not. All right, so density dependent limiting factors, okay, meaning that the more dense the population is, right, the closer organisms live to each other, right, then the more likely they are to be impacted by competition. Okay, if suddenly you have, again, lots of extra snakes in the environment, okay, then they're going to compete for resources, right, such as food, right. The more organisms in a population, the more predation is going to take place. If we're talking about, in this case, this hawk, okay, more predators, then that's going to decrease the population of maybe the mice that's feeding on. I think that's a mouse, can't really tell, okay? Maybe it's a squirrel, who knows? Parasitism, the more densely populated a species is, the more likely parasites can move from one individual to the next. And then disease spread, okay, the more densely populated a population is, the easier disease is going to spread from one individual to the next, right? And so those are all going to limit the size of populations based on density. Density independent limiting factors, these are factors that are going to impact populations regardless of their size. So unusual weather, like we had Hurricane Laura that came through, you know, about 3-4 weeks ago. That's going to impact populations regardless of their size. Seasonal cycles, natural disasters, of course, I just mentioned one, but even just unusual weather patterns that are not necessarily touted as being a natural disaster, okay, those will impact populations regardless of size. And then human impact. So we tend to impact populations independently, okay, or independent of their population density, right? So notice here you've got clear cutting of a forest. It's not going to matter how many trees are in the forest as far as just how that's a density independent limiting factor. Okay, and we're going to look at these a little more closely as well. You've got a drought situation, you've got a fire shown there, okay, on the left and then in the middle for the drought.